Welcome to the National Gallery of Art. My name is David Gariff. I'm a senior lecturer here at the gallery. Today I present the first lecture in our summer series of talks normally held each year at the gallery. This summer's theme is staycation. I begin our series with a talk about the city of Milan, Italy. Milan's story is very much a tale of two cities, a tale of the old and historic versus the new and modern, of famous monuments and hidden treasures. Milan is a city known for its politics, economics, education, media, fashion, food, art, architecture, design, and music, most especially opera. It was an important ancient Roman city and a major Christian city. It is an urban metropolis, but also connected to the fertile agricultural region of the Po Valley. It is a center of industry and manufacturing, but also known for its artisan and craft traditions, producing unique luxury goods. I'm showing you on the screen now the Italian peninsula, and Milan is located in the upper left-hand corner. And on the right slide, that red region is the region of Lombardy, and that is the region in which Milan is located. Here's a closer view of Lombardy with Milan in the center, and close by the surrounding cities. Especially important is Bergamo up to the northeast. Lombardy is one of 12 administrative regions in Italy. Milan is the capital of the region of Lombardy. In terms of population, Milan is the second largest city in Italy. Rome is first with about 2,300,000 inhabitants. Milan is next with around 1,200,000 inhabitants. And then Naples and Turin follow. Here are the actual provinces within Lombardy, so that the region is then divided into provinces, and there are 12 administrative provinces that you see named here. Then the provinces are again subdivided into what they call communes, and there are about 1,500 communes that make up the region of Lombardy. This image I think is slightly blurry, so I apologize for that. But that red triangle that you see in the left is the triangle that links Milan to the city of Turin. And my colleague Eric Denker will be talking later about the city of Turin or Torino. And then the triangle is completed by Genoa. That triangle is known as the industrial triangle of Italy. This is the industrial heartland of the entire country, where most of the manufacturing and industry are located. Here's a modern view of the Milan skyline. It's a city that has changed throughout the centuries and is especially involved at the moment in a whole new kind of building program that I'll refer to as we go along. This image here is of the Piazza del Duomo, the main city square in Milan that takes its name from the cathedral, the Duomo, that you see on the right. And this still today remains the heart of the city in so many aspects, but especially the heart of the city in terms of culture and social activity. Here's the Cathedral of Milan. The actual proper name for the city, for the Cathedral of Milan is Saint Mary of the Nativity, Santa Maria Nascente. It's the seat of the Archbishop of Milan. It's obviously a Gothic cathedral. It is the fifth largest church in the world, and it's the second largest church in Italy. The cathedral took roughly 6 centuries to complete. So there were many building programs throughout the century, well into the 19th century. Here's another view. In terms of the Gothic style, Milan Cathedral is an amalgam of really two other Gothic styles, the French and the English, what we sometimes call the French flamboyant style and the English perpendicular style. So it is a kind of hybrid of two traditional Gothic styles. Here is the interior. with the ribbed vaults. It's, as I said, a very large interior, and one feels, as with so many Gothic cathedrals, the sense of being overcome and dwarfed by the immensity of the space. The outside, however, is particularly interesting, and this is a view of the crossing where the nave and the transept meet from the exterior. You'll notice all of the additional sculptures, gargoyles. It's a heavily encrusted exterior surface. And once again, the elements that are on the exterior, and for example, the sculptures, date anywhere from the beginning of the building program all the way up into the 19th century. Now, of particular importance for the Milanese is the figure that rests atop the cathedral, and that's this gilded copper. It's embossed in gilded copper. It's a figure, what's known as the Madonnina, the little Madonna, and this rests at the top of the very highest spire of the cathedral. This was erected in the 18th century, 1762. That's a height of about 356 feet. The spire was designed by an architect named Francesco Croce, and the actual figure of the Madonnina was designed and executed by a sculptor named Giuseppe Verdi in about 1774. What's important for the Milanese about the Madonnina, first off, she's the protectress of the city, so that's particularly important. But the other fact related to the Madonnina is that no building in Milan can be higher than the Madonnina. Now, you've probably already thought that there must be modern skyscrapers that are higher than the cathedral, and you're absolutely right. But when that takes place, when a new building is erected, what the city does is to make a replica of the Madonnina and place her then at the top of the new building so that she still remains the highest element in the city. For example, one of the great pieces of 20th century architecture in Milan is this building on the left. This is the Pirelli building, named for the tire company. It was their headquarters, and it's by the Italian architect Gio Ponti. This is a building from the 1950s. When this building was erected in the 50s, it was the highest building in Milan. But the building on the right is now much higher, and this is a building that was erected in 2010. It's referred to as the Palazzo Lombardia, the Lombardy Palace. It is higher than the Pirelli building, and it is in fact the site for the regional government. So these are two buildings that are much higher than the cathedral and higher than the Madonnina. But here you see what was done when the buildings were being erected. These are the replicas. On the left was the Madonnina sitting atop the Pirelli building, so she would still be the highest point in the city. And then on the right is when she was situated on top of the Lombardy Palace, the Palazzo Lombardia, the higher skyscraper. So she always maintains this position of primacy, no matter what buildings are being erected and how high they are. Adjacent to the cathedral, it comes right off of the Piazza del Duomo, is the Royal Palace, which in Italian is referred to as the Palazzo Reale. And you're looking at that here. This building has undergone a whole host of different renovations and building programs. It was the seat of the Milan government going back to the Middle Ages, when it was known as the Palazzo del Broletto Vecchio. But then through the years, it was changed, renovated, enlarged, and the way we see it today is essentially its 18th century style. It was rebuilt in this neoclassical style in the 18th century. 1773 is when it opened. And this was done by one of Milan's most famous architects in the period of the 18th century. And that's the architect Giuseppe Marini. We'll come back to him a little bit later. This building today is multi-purpose. It's no longer the seat of the government, but it is used for cultural events, exhibitions of art, and some cultural offices that are housed in here as well. You can see the Palazzo Reale here off to the left, and just off to the right from the Palazzo is this building. Now, this today is the Museum of Modern Art. It's referred to today as the Museo del Novecento, the Museum of the 20th Century. That was, again, an old palazzo that you see, that three-tiered structure. It was the Palazzo del Arengario, and it was decided to renovate that palazzo and to turn it into a museum devoted to 20th century art. This museum opened in December of 2010. It's mainly devoted to Italian works from the 20th century. The collection runs to about 400 works of art, and the artists who are best represented in this collection are, as you might expect, the Italian futurists, who essentially emerged from the city of Milan. So works by Giacomo Balla, Umberto Boccioni, Carlo Carrà, Luigi Russolo, Gino Severini, all of the original members of Italian futurism. Their works are very well represented here in this new museum dedicated to the 20th century. Now, if you climb to the top of the cathedral and are in that area, well, you're along the roof line, and you look back down into the Piazza del Duomo, you see another building that today defines Milan, and it defines the Piazza del Duomo, and that is the so-called Galleria, the gallery of Milan, and you can see the entrance through that triumphal arch there, staring straight ahead and down. Here's basically another view of the entrance to the Galleria. Now, the proper title to the Galleria is the Galleria Vittorio Emanuele, Victor Emmanuel, who's one of the kings of Italy. It was designed in 1861, so it's a 19th century structure. And it was constructed between 1865 and 1877. The architect here is, again, one of the most important in Italian architectural history in Milan in the 19th century, and that's the architect Giuseppe Mengoni. He's responsible for the design of the Galleria. Here's a kind of three-dimensional model of the Galleria on the left, which is this cruciform shape. It has one long kind of nave, we might call it, and then a kind of shorter, two arms that are shorter along the crossing. And in the center is a large dome. The Mengoni was born just outside of the city of Bologna, but his career really did take place within the city of Milan. There's the entrance again today, looking into the Galleria and into the steel and glass structure that's in the center. I'll come back to that in a minute. Here's a kind of floor plan. So in the slide on the left, you can see the cathedral, and to the left of that is a kind of a monument to Victor Emmanuel, that other little square area. But we're looking north, just or to the top of the slide, and you can see that cross shape, and that is the entrance to the Galleria, which is off of the Piazza del Duomo. And then if you were to walk straight back and not make any turns, just all the way through from the Piazza del Duomo to the top piazza, that would enter, or you would enter then the Piazza della Scala, which is where the opera house is, where La Scala Opera is located. Then there are those two shorter arms that create the cross. So you see it again with the slide on the right, which I've actually rotated so that it is exactly the same as what you're looking at on the left. The entrance to the Galleria down below, which would be the Piazza del Duomo. And if you were to walk straight through and exit up at the top, you'd then be entering the Piazza della Scala. So here is the interior of the Galleria. It's a magnificent piece of architecture. In fact, the glass and steel construction, iron construction, had a great influence on the later building of the Eiffel Tower in Paris. But it's not just the architecture; it's what this shape, what this space has really become for the Milanese, and it's sort of referred to often as their drawing room, as their salon, because it's filled with so many important restaurants, cafes. Today, of course, as you can see in the slide, also some of the leading fashion houses have shops here, Prada, Louis Vuitton, all of these. Here you see it a little better. There's a tragic side to the Galleria that relates to Mengoni himself. He oversaw the design and the construction of the Galleria, and he was making some final assessments on December 30th, 1877. He was up along the roof line, and he suffered a fall, and in fact, that fall killed him. And the next day was supposed to be the inauguration of the Galleria. So technically, he was tragically killed in a fall the day before the structure was to be formally inaugurated. This space, the restaurants, the cafes, attracted the attention and the admiration of numerous travelers to Milan. The list is very long of people who wrote about this space: Ernest Hemingway, Henry James, but also Mark Twain. Mark Twain visited Milan, and in his book titled A Tramp Abroad, published in 1880, which is a kind of a travel log, he referred to the Galleria as follows: "In Milan, we spent most of the time inside the great and magnificent loggia, or galleria, or whatever it's called, edifices formed by tall and sumptuous new structures. This is the Galleria. I'd like to live there forever." So that was often the feeling most writers and visitors to Milan had. This was the place they frequented the most during their visits. Now, you may be aware of the fact that Milan, because of its strategic location, suffered greatly during the Second World War. So here are photographs of the Galleria after it had been bombarded by Allied bombers, mainly the Royal Air Force from Great Britain. These photographs are from August 1943, right after the bombardment. Milan was a strategic city during the Second World War. It linked up Southern Europe with Northern Europe. It was an industrial city. It produced a lot of important materials for the war effort, for the Axis powers initially, and of course the railroads linked the north to the south. So the bombing of Milan by the Allied forces began really in 1940. Initially it was the RAF, and they bombed also, as you might imagine, that industrial triangle that I mentioned to you between Genoa, Turin, and Milan, because that's where mainly heavy industry was located. By 1943, of course, there was the fall of Mussolini, and with that, there was Mussolini's successor, General Badoglio. But the Allies felt that they really wanted to pressure the Italians to abandon their allegiance to the Axis, so they stepped up the bombing in Italy, in specific Italian cities, hoping that the people would finally just decide that they basically wanted to switch sides. So that's what happened in the raids of the summer of 1943. Milan was very heavily bombed, and now it was being bombed not just in its industrial sites, but also in the heart of the city. We know in 1943, at least 900 people in Milan perished as a result of Allied bombing, about 850 people in Turin, and that was just over a 2-month period of July and August. They did these bombing raids because they were in the heart of the city. They did very much hit very much accidentally at times, but almost impossible to avoid, many of the major cultural landmarks of Milan. So including the Galleria that you see here, bombs destroyed good parts of the Basilica of Saint Ambrose, Santa Maria della Grazia, where Leonardo's Last Supper is housed, the Palazzo Reale that I showed you, and the Opera House of La Scala. Within the Sempione Park is another landmark of Milan, and that is the great castle, or the Castello Sforzesco, built by the Sforza family, Duke Lodovico Sforza. The Sforzas ruled Milan. Two of the great families that ruled Milan during the period of the Renaissance were the Visconti family. They were very old, going back well before the Renaissance. And then the Sforza family, most famously represented by Lodovico Sforza. He's responsible for bringing Leonardo da Vinci to Milan. But this is the residence, the fort, the castello of the Sforza. Today, it houses a very important museum, in fact, a number of museums today. And in one of those museums is located a very famous work by Michelangelo, and that is his final Pietà, the so-called Rondanini Pietà, which occupied Michelangelo from 1552 right up to a few days before his death in 1564. Now, what you're looking at here on the far left is the sculpture that, as it's about to be moved. This used to be located in a different part of the Castello, and it was decided in the year 2015 to take it from what had been known as the Scarlione Gallery, which had been in a different part of the castle, to a new part of the castle that was, in fact, had been built in the 16th century. So it would be exactly contemporary with the sculpture. And that new location is what you see on the far right. So it was moved from its previous location to its new location on the right in the year 2015. And it does very much now the setting, the architecture, because it's contemporary with the sculpture. And it's just a very pleasant room with light, natural light. It's been a very successful relocation. Here it is again. So this museum now, this part of the castle, is referred to as the Museo della Pietà, the Museum of the Pietà, referring to Michelangelo's work that's now housed there. Now, if people come to Milan and they only know of one reason or think of one reason to come, it's normally to come to see Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, and that takes a visitor to this church here. This is the Church of Santa Maria della Grazia in Milan. The latest or the last sort of architectural part of it dates to the 15th century, 1492 to 98, but it's a much older church. It sits on the square on the piazza of the same name. Basically, this was begun around 1466. The apse, which is at that far end that you see on the right, is an incredibly beautiful part of the building, and that was in fact designed by Bramante, who was a resident of Milan for a long period of time. He also designed the cloister and the old sacristy. And what is, of course, housed here is the great mural by Leonardo da Vinci of the Last Supper. Here we're looking into the cloister at winter time. Milan is a beautiful city in winter. So we're looking at that part of the building, especially designed by Bramante and the cloister. And here's what you find today when you enter the refectory. This is the restored version now of the Last Supper here. Here's a more historic photograph of the church in the 1940s. And I mentioned to you the fact that the church was damaged in the Second World War by Allied bombings. And here is the church in 1943, when these heavy raids in July and August of 1943. The 2 days that were the heaviest bombing were August 15th and 16th, 1943, when the center of Milan was hit very heavily by Allied bombs. In terms of the bombing programs in Italy in the Second World War, the Americans bombed essentially southern Italy, and it was the British who were assigned to essentially bomb northern Italy. So those duties were divided up that way. Milan was one of the most heavily bombed cities in northern Italy, and it was probably the most heavily bombed city in the entire country. Now here is the destruction of the refectory, and trying to show you with those red lines what is missing. An Allied bomb barely missed destroying the wall in the refectory that had the Last Supper. And that's, I don't have a pointer to show you, but it's in the upper left of the screen. And you can see that straight red line. That was one of the walls of the refectory. And then you see that kind of barricaded wall. That's the wall that housed the Last Supper. So the fact that it had been protected by sandbags and scaffolding turned out to be very important. But the rest of the cloister, etc., is donated by that red square. And so that's essentially the obliteration of a good chunk of the church. Here's a kind of cross-section showing you the cloister, this diagonal line. That rectangular box that's numbered number 4, which is where that red line begins, that's the refectory. And that red line is right on the center of the wall that houses the Last Supper. What's interesting about that is if you follow that diagonal line to the church, so follow that diagonal to the lower right, you end up right at the main altar of the cathedral, of the church, I should say. And so this was a way, clearly Leonardo was aware of these strategic locations. And the Last Supper, which is a celebration of the Eucharist, what happens at the Mass, clearly in his mind related to what would be happening on the altar of the church as well. Here is what the Italians did to try to protect the Last Supper during the Second World War. They hung curtains to protect a part of the wall, and then they sandbagged the entire wall. Then they built a wooden scaffolding to go across the entire painting, hopefully to protect it from bombing, from vibration, and other trauma. And it worked, because here are the photographs of the refectory pretty much utterly destroyed, but that wall that has the wooden planks and the scaffolding is the wall of the Last Supper, and that remained standing. So it was something of a miracle. Now, the other issue about the Last Supper is simply that because of Leonardo's faulty technique, because of all of these other rather ineffective attempts to preserve the painting, which only, in fact, further increased its disintegration. In the Napoleonic period, when Napoleon's men entered Milan, they stabled their horses in the refectory, and the soldiers used the Last Supper as target practice. So the painting had, through the centuries, suffered greatly. This is the painting as it was seen in the 1970s. And it was a painting that showed very little of Leonardo because it had been so heavily overpainted and adjusted by restorers throughout the centuries. Now, this is a painting that you can see not in Italy, but in London at the Royal Academy of Arts. Leonardo's painting was so famous in its own day that, like the Sistine ceiling and the Sistine Chapel paintings by Michelangelo, artists immediately began to make copies of the work. And this is a copy of the Last Supper made in 1520 by, we think, two different artists. One we know for sure was Giampietrino, who was a kind of close associate of Leonardo's, but we think another artist named Boltraffio also worked on this. This is an oil on canvas. It's large, it's to the scale of the original, it's a copy, and it was made soon after the Last Supper, about 20 years after the Last Supper was finished. And today it's housed at the Royal Academy of Arts in London. Now, what's important in terms of having this copy is that it shows us all of the details of the Last Supper that we can no longer see today in the actual mural because they long since disappeared. So, for example, if you look under the table and look at the feet of the apostles and of Jesus, we can now clearly see in the copy all of the detail that was originally there, the sandals, but especially we can see all of the elements on the tabletop. Here is Judas holding his money bag, which now, based on the copy, we can see very clearly. And of course, one of the famous moments here of the fresco or of the story is when, in this painting, Jesus is essentially announcing that someone will betray him. Judas holds the money bag, but then with that same hand, he knocks over the salt cellar, which of course is bad luck. And in the copy, we can see that salt cellar and the salt coming out of it as it's been tipped over by Judas because he's so shocked by the words that Jesus has just uttered. These are details that were essentially lost to us through the centuries. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the woman who is responsible for bringing the Last Supper back to us as best she could, and that's the woman that you see here on the left. On the left, she's working on a different fresco. She's a conservator, and she's working on a different fresco with one of her colleagues, and that's a photograph when she was 31 years old from 1956. On the right is her at work on the Last Supper, and this is a photograph probably taken in the 1970s. Her name was Pinin Brambilla Barcelone. Now, it's important to recognize this woman's contribution and achievement. Here she is again later in life in the refectory at work on the Last Supper. These are photographs from 1983 on the left and 1985 on the right. This is the completion of her restoration of the Last Supper, the way you would see it today if you entered the refectory. It still has a somewhat ghostly cast to it, but now when we look at the painting, everything that we're looking at that remains on the surface is Leonardo. It's no longer the work of restorers from the 17th or 18th or 19th centuries. Anything that was not original to Leonardo's hand was removed. And while we're left with some ghostly images in some places, nonetheless, now we can at least appreciate what Leonardo's painting must have looked like. So the painting is not a fresco. It is a combination of tempera paint, painted on gesso, the way one would prepare a panel, with some carbon, with some pitch and some mastic. So he was experimenting here, hoping that he could work more slowly. But in fact, that, as I said, that experiment was not successful. Here is Pinin Brambilla Barcelone at work on the fresco. These are photographs from the 1970s. You'll notice on the right, she's working with this high-powered microscope that allows her to see exactly how the paint was layered, what was painted over what. There would be days during this restoration when the technique was so meticulous that within a day's work, she could only restore about a postage stamp piece of the painting. In other words, that's about the amount of work she might be able to get done in one day, would be a tiny little square in the restoration. Here are three photographs that show you the restoration in progress. On the left is what she encountered initially, which is to say all of those previous restorations that had covered the painting. So it has many areas that are heavily overpainted. In the center is where she was beginning to do these test panels. Those are those little squares and rectangles to see how and what technique might work best for the cleaning. And then on the right is that same figure of Jesus after the restoration. Here again is Penin Brambilla Barcelona at work. The painting still faces some problems today, and I'll talk more about the controlled environment, but certainly still the pollution in Milan from traffic is still a threat to the picture. And I wanted to show you this because this is, I guess, my tribute to Penin Brambilla. On the left is an undated photograph of her. In the middle is the photograph I showed you from 1956 when she's about 31 years old. And on the right is her photograph from 2005 when she was 80 years old. Now, she was born in 1925. She began restoration of The Last Supper in 1977 when she was 52 years old. And she finished her restoration in 1999 when she was 74 years old, and then she retired. In essence, her entire adult life as a restorer and conservator was dedicated to The Last Supper. So here is the refectory today. The control of this environment has changed over time. 25 people now are allowed to view the fresco at one time. Before, it was an unlimited amount of people, and that would affect the temperature and humidity. You now, before you approach the refectory, you have to go through a series of airlocks that are essentially devices that are used to remove pollutants that might be attached to your body, various kinds of germs or pollen, etc. You have to buy tickets in advance now, so the control of the crowds of the tourists is part of the attempt to preserve the picture now in its present state. Maybe the most important medieval building in Milan is this one. This is the Basilica of Saint Ambrose, Saint Ambrose. It's a Romanesque structure built between 1050 and 1128. Remember that Milan was briefly the capital of the rest of the Western Roman Empire. It was the home of Saint Ambrose. Sant Ambrogio is Saint Ambrose. Little remains of the original church of Sant Ambrose, Sant Ambrogio. This is the 11th century structure, it's a Lombard Romanesque structure that was built over the remains of the original church. This is the atrium as one approaches through these porticos. There's a bell tower. This building set the standard for Lombard Romanesque architecture. So when you see other great buildings of the Romanesque in northern Italy, especially in Lombardy, they are very often influenced by this building. Here's the interior, main nave with two side aisles. There is an altar, you can just see it there, the gold altar, which dates back to Charlemagne's days. And in the crypt, there's a crypt here, and that contains today the skeletal remains of Saint Ambrose himself. Like Santa Maria delle Grazie, this was also bombed heavily during the Second World War, and here it is in August of 1943. So again, virtually the entire structure has been reconstructed after the war. Walking through Milan, it's easy to miss some of the locations and monuments. It's not a city like Venice or like Florence or like Rome that kind of assaults you, where you immediately know you're in a particular location based on the monuments. Milan is more secretive, which in fact requires people to remain longer in Milan, which is something they don't do because most people just think the only thing to see is the Last Supper. But this is one of the most important centers in Milan, in medieval Milan. It's the Piazza Mercanti, and it's comprised of three different buildings. There's a loggia to the left, the very far left, the Loggia degli Ossi. Then there's a palace that you see next on the left of the Scuola Palatine. And then on the right is another important building, and that's the Palazzo della Ragione. So the Piazza Mercanti, or the Square of the Merchants, was the central square in medieval Milan. It was the heart of the city in the Middle Ages. In the 13th century, there were 6 entry points to the square, and each one was associated with a specific trade or guild. So it had that same medieval connotation of the guilds as we often talk about in Florence. Here is the Palazzo della Ragione again. It's a medieval structure. The vaulting goes back to 1223. It was the former seat of the governor in medieval Milan. And Palazzo della Ragione means the Palace of Reason. Now, moving ahead into another one of Milan's well-known landmarks, that's the opera house, the Teatro della Scala, here in the Piazza della Scala. Now, La Scala, the teatro, the theater, was founded under the auspices of the Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. It was meant to replace a previous theater that had been destroyed by a fire. It stood on the location of an old church going way back into Milan's history called the Church of Santa Maria alla Scala, and that's where the name La Scala comes from, the church that had once been on this location. It was designed by Giuseppe Marini, the architect I mentioned when I mentioned the Palazzo Reale. And it opened, La Scala opened on August 3rd, 1778. And the opening opera that premiered at the opening was by Antonio Salieri. It was L'Europa Riconosciuta. Here's a photograph that was taken around 1976 of the opera house in the piazza. And remember, I mentioned that if you were to walk through the Galleria from the Piazza del Duomo, you would eventually empty in straight. If you walked straight back, you would empty into this piazza of the opera house. Now, this too was bombed in the Second World War. And here is the Allied bombing, the effects of the Allied bombing on the theater from August 15th, 1943. So this has been restored and reconstructed as well in the post-war period. But then something else was added, and that is that the Opera House went through a major renovation from 2002 to 2004. You can see that kind of block building to the left. There's a blocky structure, and then there's that circular structure. This was part of the major renovation that La Scala underwent between 2002 and 2004. And it finally reopened in 2005. The architect who was given this commission was Mario Botta, the Swiss architect, Mario Botta. It was a wonderful project, and it really did change the nature of what could be produced at the Opera House, and many improvements to the structure, to the sound quality, etc. It wasn't without controversy, since this was such a important opera house in the world. Here is Botta's three-dimensional design. Botta was born in 1943. He's Swiss, but he was trained in Milan. If you know the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, he designed that building. He was influenced by Le Corbusier, Louis Kahn. So he added that whole superstructure behind the original building. And here again, you can sort of see that part. there were many improvements to La Scala. You were now able, after the restoration, renovation, you were able to look or read the libretto of the opera being performed on the seat in front of you, much like we have at the Met in New York. The renovated Opera House reopened on December 7th, 2004, and it reopened with the same opera by Salieri that it had opened with originally, L'Europa Riconosciuta, this time conducted by Riccardo Muti. And so this date, by the way, of December 7th in Milan is important because it is the feast day of Saint Ambrose, and the Milanese opera season always opens on December 7th. That's the rule. So whatever the first opera of the season is, it has to open on December 7th. Here is the restored, reconstructed interior of La Scala, famous for this, this chandelier. La Scala was the first public building to be illuminated by the Edison Electric Company, and that was in 1883. In fact, the whole city of Milan has a position of primacy in the transition from gaslight to electricity. Now, that chandelier was destroyed in the war, but so today we see a copy of the original, and it did originally comprise 383 light bulbs. When you talk about Milan and when you talk about La Scala, the person who comes to mind immediately, of course, who's forever associated with this city and with this opera house, is Giuseppe Verdi. Here's a photograph of Verdi in Paris on the left from 1855. He would have been about 42 years old. On the right, he's walking past La Scala reading a newspaper in this photograph from around the year 1900. This is the hotel, the Grand Hotel Milan, the way it looks today, which is just down the street from La Scala. And this is the hotel where Giuseppe Verdi died. Well, he had been living in this hotel. When he became seriously ill, he was essentially spending his final days in this hotel. And he died on January 27th, 1901. When people heard that he was ill and that was in his bed and suffering, the citizens of Milan actually covered the street from La Scala to the hotel with straw so that there would be no noises of horses' hoofs and wagons and carts going by that might disturb Verdi. He was an incredibly beloved figure in the city. Part of the reason he was so beloved is because he had often been associated with Italy's desire to become liberated from the Austrians during the period of the Risorgimento. And this cartoon or postcard from 1901 sort of illustrates that people during the period of the Risorgimento, when the Austrians were in control of the city, very often people would write on the wall the graffiti that said "Viva Verdi," and when they were confronted by Austrian police about this graffiti, they said, well, we're just celebrating our most beloved composer, Giuseppe Verdi. But what had been known among the Italian insurgents was that Verdi had become a sort of an acronym for the phrase in Italian, Victor Emmanuel, King of Italy. So by placing this graffiti on various walls around Milan, secretly they were attesting to their desire to have a liberated Italy to become its own nation, which of course is what the Risorgimento struggle was all about. Here's the newspaper, the Corriere della Sera, which is still with us today, announcing the death of Verdi. This edition was a two-day edition, Monday, Tuesday, January 28th, 29th, 1901. This is Verdi's funeral. It was a state funeral. This is the procession on January 30th, 1901. Verdi dies on January 27th, 1901. His body laid in state at the town hall. And then the funeral procession that would take his body from the town hall to the monumental cemetery. Was about a 45-minute procession, is what you see going on here. And people spontaneously broke into a chorus that came from one of Verdi's operas, Nabucco. The chorus was Va Pensiero, and it talked about the desire in the opera for the Jews to be liberated from the Assyrians during this opera, this historical opera. But that song, that chorus, had always been associated with the Italians' desire to be liberated from the Austrians. So people spontaneously broke out into that chorus as Verdi's casket was brought to the cemetery. Here again, you see the crowds. It was estimated that half the city of Milan walked in this procession, added to by many, many mourners who came from all over Italy to be a part of this. Some 300,000 people accompanied the coffin to the monumental cemetery. Today in Milan, there is a famous home for retired musicians, and it is what you're looking at here. This is the Casa di Riposo per Musicisti, the house of rest for musicians. And this is a home for retired opera singers and musicians late in their careers. And this was created by Verdi in 1896. So it still functions today. It's a neo-Gothic building built by a friend of his named Camillo Boito. Verdi is buried here, along with his wife, Giuseppina Strapponi, his second wife. And what he did in order to build this and to ensure its security through the years was he bequeathed all of his future royalties from his operas to the Casa di Riposo. So this is still a functioning rest home for retired singers and musicians. It was completed in 1899. Verdi did not want any residents to move in, however, until after he died. So after his death in 1901, it then became open to needy retired singers and musicians. This was the project dearest to Verdi's heart. He mentioned and talked about it. And at one point, he wrote, quote, "Of all my works, that which pleases me the most is the casa that I had built in Milan to shelter elderly singers who have not been favored by fortune, or who, when they were young, did not have the virtue of saving their money, poor and dear companions of my life." He was especially concerned about composers, musicians, singers who might have had wealth at one time, but then ended up late in life being very poor. These are the tombs of Verdi on the right and of his second wife, Giuseppina Strapponi, on the left, that are at the Casa today. In addition to composers, Milan is so associated with music, but it's also associated with literature in terms of its famous native sons and citizens. This is the house of Alessandro Manzoni. Manzoni is one of the great literary figures in Milanese history and in Italian history, for that matter. He was born in Milan and he died in Milan. This is his house on the left, and then the interior, the main salon on the right. Manzoni is associated with a very important novel in Italian literary history. Its title is I Promessi Sposi, The Betrothed. It's a vast, epic kind of historical novel. It was published originally in 3 volumes in 1827, but then Manzoni continued to rewrite the work, not so much for changing the story, but for changing the approach to the Italian language. In that regard, probably next to the Divine Comedy by Dante, I Promessi Sposi is the most important book in the history of the Italian language. Earlier and throughout Italian linguistic history, everybody very often was writing in their local dialects. The Divine Comedy is actually written in a Tuscan dialect. But the desire by the 19th century to have a unified language, a standard Italian, was very much on the minds of various literary figures and linguists. Manzoni was at the heart of this discussion. At first, he thought about his own Milanese dialect as appropriate. Eventually, he thought that, in fact, the dialect that should be the basis for proper formal Italian, standardized Italian, was the Tuscan dialect of Dante. So he kept rewriting I Promessi Sposi to turn it into a kind of lexicon of language. So today, when one tries to understand the Italian language, its history and development, the two most important books are the Divine Comedy by Dante and I Promessi Sposi by Manzoni. Here is an image of Manzoni's funeral at the left, May 29th, 1873, and then a portrait of Manzoni on the right by Francesco Hayez, an important 19th century painter, and that's at the Brera Museum today in Milan. I mentioned that Verdi was originally, his body, his coffin was originally transported to the Monumental Cemetery in Milan before it was transferred to the Casa di Riposo. And this is the great 19th century monumental cemetery in Milan. That is one of the most important and most moving cemeteries in all of Europe, much like Père Lachaise in Paris. It has a tremendous number of tombs from the 19th century, very evocative and original. Many important Italians are buried here, especially those from Milan. But it's when you stroll through the grounds that you begin to see this. Of course, this is the resting place for Manzoni. And if you'll notice back here, that great central building is called the Famedio. Famedio would be like a memorial chapel, but even maybe more a hall of fame, we might call it. And in the center of that structure is where Manzoni rests today, because he's such an important figure in Italian and Milanese history. But as one goes through the cemetery, one sees the most incredible, evocative, poignant, sad, often grieving monuments by a whole host of important 19th century Italian sculptors. I'm not going to go through and mention all their names, but just quickly show you a few examples. This whole idea of a monumental cemetery goes back to Napoleon, actually, in 1804, when he had issued a decree that there should no longer be any burials in the interiors of churches under the floors for health and sanitation reasons. And once you could no longer bury people underneath cathedrals or churches, you had to create essentially the modern idea of an open air outdoor cemetery. So the monuments here, for the one, for example, on the left, go back to the First World War, go well back before that. Here again. And now that takes us to a new part of the city, a different part, I should say, of the city. And this is the part of the city where the great museum, the Brera, which is the major art museum in Milan, much like the Uffizi in Florence, where the Brera is located. And this is the courtyard of the Brera. So we're looking now at the courtyard of the Pinacoteca, the museum of the Brera. The building is a 17th century palazzo. It houses one of Italy's finest collections of medieval and Renaissance art. Some of the most famous Renaissance paintings that we are all familiar with are housed in the Brera. So, for example, this painting on the left by Giovanni Bellini, the Pietà, or the Dead Christ, supported by the Madonna and St. John. Maybe even more famously, of course, on the right is Mantegna's Dead Christ from 1480. The Bellini dates from 1460. Piero del Francesca's great Brera altarpiece, sometimes referred to as the Montefeltro altar from 1472 on the left, and Raphael's Marriage of the Virgin on the right from 1504. These are all housed at the Brera. But when you say Brera to a Milanese, it's not just a museum, it's a neighborhood. The neighborhood around the Brera, which has both the museum and the School of Fine Arts, is essentially the neighborhood that would be comparable to Montparnasse or Montmartre in Paris. It's a bohemian part of town famous for artists who lived there, narrow streets with very evocative titles, and many cafes and bistros that were frequented by Milanese painters and writers, composers. So the Brera is a neighborhood as much as it is a museum and a school of fine arts. If we continue to look at some of Milan's great museums, we look at the Ambrosiana, the Pinacoteca Ambrosiana that you see here. And again, what's interesting is that how many of these museums are off the street. If you don't know how to find them, you won't find them. So again, Milan tends to hide itself in some ways, and one has to know what one is looking for. So this collection focuses on art essentially from the 15th to the 17th centuries. It houses a number of treasures that we're again all familiar with. But one of the most important is the original full-scale cartoon by Raphael for the School of Athens that's in the Vatican. It's very rare for a cartoon for a fresco to survive because the cartoon was just a way of transferring the design to the wall, and most artists discarded the cartoons. But in this case, the Raphael cartoon survives. So at the top, you're looking at the full-scale cartoon. It's the full scale to the painting in Rome, which you see at the bottom. You'll notice there are some differences between what the cartoon originally looked like and what the painting looked like. In other words, he added certain figures. I don't really have time to go through all of that, but nonetheless, to have the original Raphael cartoon survive is an incredible luxury to be able to see his drawing before it was actually transferred to the wall. Other well-known works in the Ambrosiana. This painting on the left is given to Leonardo da Vinci, but it's a very much disputed attribution. It's a portrait of a musician from 1490. Many people do not believe it's by Leonardo. People in Milan believe it is by Leonardo. If it is a Leonardo, it would be the only example we have of a male portrait. All of Leonardo's portraits are of females, like our Ginevra da Vinci at the museum. But this, if it is Leonardo, would be the sole example we have of a male portrait. We don't know who it is. There are tantalizing clues, other names that associated Bernardino Luini, Giovanni Boltraffio, so that remains disputed. The painting on the right is solidly given, and that's to the painter Caravaggio. This is Caravaggio's Basket of Fruit from 1599. That's housed at the Ambrosiana, one of the few examples of still life painting by Caravaggio. Now, another museum that again is really off the street. You wouldn't even know it unless you looked at those banners on the left, because you have to go through that doorway. And once you go through that doorway, you enter a courtyard. And the museum that you're at is the Poldi Pezzoli Museum. And here again, major landmark paintings, especially from the Renaissance, and especially by Botticelli. This is the Madonna of the Book on the left by Botticelli. This painting was in Washington, D.C. for an exhibition not too long ago, from 1480-81. And then the great Lamentation over the Dead Christ on the right by Botticelli from 1495. Now, I talked about an industrial triangle for Milan that was comprised Genoa, Turin, and Milan. Within Milan, there's another important zone. It's not a triangle, it's a quadrilateral. And this is the great fashion center of Milan. Milan is a city of fashion and design. And the streets that are famous worldwide for fashion in Milan are comprised and fall within this quadrilateral that essentially comprises the Via Monte Napoleone, the Via Manzoni, the Via della Spiga, and the Corso Venezia. Along the Via della Spiga, again, every important designer in the world that one can think of, especially Italian and French designers, are represented on these streets within this section of Milan. The Via Monte Napoleone. These are sometimes called the smart streets in Milan, where people of fashion, people interested in fashion and fashionable people congregate. Milan has an incredible train station, and this is the central station in Milan that was first built in 1864, but then it was renovated to make it larger and more impressive in 1906. And the architect who was responsible for that enlargement and redesign was the architect Ulisse Stacchini. He based his new design on the baths of Caracalla, where you can see the immensity of the train station. He was influenced by the baths of Caracalla in Rome, but he was also aware of the great Beaux-Arts railway stations in the United States. So he was in some ways speaking to both of those traditions. The construction here lasted until 1931, so from 1906 to 31. By 31, of course, Mussolini was in power, and he thought the design should be even more monumental and more bombastic, and he was especially interested in more sculptural decoration, like these winged horses that one finds on the exterior. Here's the interior. Much like the great stations in America, most especially like the original Penn Station in New York City. Milan is a city of transportation and transportation networks. It is serviced, of course, by a major airport, Malpensa. In fact, there are two airports, Malpensa and Linate. It's serviced by the railroads, which we've talked about during the Second World War. It has a subway system, it has buses, and it still has original trams that are running, much like the trams or the trolleys in San Francisco. These are some of the original cars here that date back to 1928, and they still function today in the city. So you have multiple transportation options. Milan is the city of modern architecture. I've already mentioned the Pirelli building at the far left, and then another view of the building in the center and at the right. This is a landmark building in the city. It was the second tallest building in Milan when completed in 1958. It rises to about 403 feet, 32 stories. It's a remarkably beautiful building because of its elegance, its simplicity, and this kind of thinness. It is a beautifully thin type of structure. It was the tallest building in Milan when it was completed in 1958, but that's no longer the case, as I've already mentioned to you. Here's some more views. The Pirelli building is essentially right across the street almost from the central station. It's a striking modernist design. Again, Gio Ponti was the architect, and he was assisted by the engineer Pierluigi Nervi. So both of them worked, because the engineering is remarkable, this long span frame structure. very long spans that you can see. This is interesting because in the building suffered an accident in 2002 when a small plane accidentally crashed into the building. It was a small private plane, and it crashed in roughly around the 24th and 25th stories of the building. Of course, as we know so well, here it was thought to be perhaps a terrorist attack, but in fact it was not. It was just an accident. 3 people were killed in the accident, and today you cannot even tell that the building had been damaged by this crash. An aspect of Milan that very few people know about, once again, because many people don't spend enough time in the city, is that Milan is also a city of canals, or what are called in Italian navigli. There's a whole canal district, the Navigli district. There are essentially 5 major canals. These were much more functional during the earlier history of Milan, the Renaissance and into the 19th century. They connected the city with some of the lake districts, Lake Como, etc., Lake Maggiore. But today they're, again, mainly these scenic canals throughout this district, and they've become home to some of Milan's famous jazz clubs, nightclubs, bars. It's a very important part of the social scene in Milan during the evenings. Jazz is very popular in Milan. Now, to bring Milan up to the present and into the future, in 2015, Milan was selected to be the host to the 2015 World Expo. That's the poster on the left. And this expo, the theme of the expo in 2015 was Feeding the Planet, Energy for Life. So all of the pavilions related to technology, innovation, culture, creativity, and how it relates especially to food and to diet. The symbol of one of the symbols of the expo was this great structure at the right called the Tree of Life. That was designed by a Milanese design firm. It's 121 feet tall. It was built in a lake on the grounds of the expo. And that pattern that you see, that leafy pattern at the top, was actually based on the pattern in the pavement of the Campidoglio up on the Capitoline Hill in Rome that was designed by Michelangelo. This was the center of the expo, and it had all kinds of various manifestations of light and color and water and sound that would change every hour. This still, when the expo closed, this has remained in place. So it's now another symbol of the city, this Tree of Life. Now, into the future, we can talk about 2026 because Milan has been selected to be the site of the Winter Olympics in 2026. It will take place in Milan and in the northern city of Cortina, where there's very good skiing. So that's one aspect of the future of Milan. And the other is related to what you see on the right. And that is a new plan for the future of Milan. The plan is called Milan 2030. So Milan is about to undergo a major ambitious redesign scheme of the entire city. And it's going to encompass the development of parks and gardens, reallocating street space from cars to cycling and pedestrian use, the redevelopment of disused areas of the city, 7 new districts revolving around sort of abandoned rail yards will also be included. In other words, Milan is going to be a model for the future. Most European designers and urban architects are looking to Milan and to this plan. It was planned for 2030, but because of the current pandemic and because Milan had to make many changes already as a result of the coronavirus, Milan has already decided to just build on that, changes that they had to make in terms of transportation and traffic. And so the plan for Milan 2030 is already underway. And so it will be a kind of beacon for future urban development for many, many countries in the world. So Italy and Milan have lived through wars and invasions, plagues, floods, droughts, earthquakes, political revolution, domestic and international terrorism, organized crime, assassinations, even the introduction of McDonald's. It suffered through all of that, but I have no doubt that this city will survive the current pandemic, and it's going to rise again without a doubt to become one of the world's most important cities of the future that will be looked at by urban planners throughout the world. Thank you very much.